Today, we're going to talk about the science of tools for fat loss. And fat loss is something that interests a large number of people. Many people want to lose fat. Many people are athletes who need to lose fat. And in general, we know that having body fat percentages that are too high is unhealthy for us. And most people struggle to lose fat. Most people struggle to lose weight generally, but most people especially struggle to lose body fat, or what we call adipose tissue. Now, this is a huge topic on the internet. There's a lot of controversy. Today, we're going to talk about some things related to fat loss and that are powerful for fat loss that I'm guessing most of you have never heard about before. You may have heard about a few of them, but I'm guessing you haven't heard about all of them. Exercise is good for you, that movement is good for you, shifted their behavior and their physiology in the direction of enhanced weight loss, fat loss, etc. So how we think about a given set of activities affects how we perform those activities, and how we think and about and perform those activities has a real effect on our physiology. So somewhere between the hard and fast rule that governs fat loss and weight loss, which is if you ingest more calories than you burn, you'll either maintain or gain weight. Typically, you'll gain weight. Exercise has been shown to lead to increases in metabolism and fat loss to greater degrees, depending on whether or not, for instance, you're fasted when you do it or not, whether or not you do your cardio first or your resistance training first. And this is, again, in a literature for which there's a lot of controversy, but in digging through all the studies on this, we're finally starting to arrive at a consensus of when is best to do exercise and what types of exercise to do if your goal is fat loss. The topic of exercise is a kind of controversial one, not as controversial as nutrition and diet, which we will talk about in a few minutes. But it's a particularly interesting one because different types of exercise engage the musculature of the body and the heart and the lungs in different ways, and can have vastly different effects on things like hormones and metabolism, depending on whether or not it's of high intensity, moderate intensity, or low intensity. So rather than think about weight training versus cardiovascular exercise, I think the most simple way, the most fluid way to have this conversation about exercise and fat loss is in terms of three general types of training. Whether or not it's done with weights or body weight doesn't really matter. And those are high-intensity interval training, something that seems to have gained a lot of popularity in recent years, so-called HIIT, H-I-I-T, so high-intensity interval training, sprint interval training, so that's going to be very high intensity, or SIT, or moderate intensity continuous training, MICT. So we've got HIIT, SIT, and MICT, MICT. And we can get a little bit more precise if you'd like. I'm not somebody who measures my VO2 max or anything while I exercise. I generally know whether or not I'm doing something I could continue for a very long time, or whether or not I'm doing something that I realize is going to be of short duration, high intensity. But if you'd like to map this to VO2 max, SIT, this sprint interval training, was defined as all out, greater than 100% of VO2 max bursts of activity that last 8 to 30 seconds, interspersed with less intense recovery periods. So this would be sprinting downfield for 8 to 30 seconds, then maybe walking back for about a minute or two, and then sprinting again and then continuing. So that would be SIT. HIIT, H-I-I-T, it's defined as submaximal, so 80 to 100% of VO2 max bursts of activity that last 60 to 240 seconds, interspersed with less intense recovery periods. So on a standard 400-meter track, just to give us a little bit of a visual, a 4-minute mile would be fantastic for most people, although people run faster than that, of course. So that's 4 60-second laps, but that's back to back to back. I think in my best shape, or maybe it was in my dreams, I don't recall which, I was able to do 60 seconds around the track, but of course I couldn't get that on the second or third or fourth. If I did, that was certainly in fantasy land and not reality. But 60 seconds would be about one revolution around the track, maybe 90 seconds, depending on how fast one is running. So 60 to 240 seconds. MICT, okay, this moderate intensity continuous training, is steady state cardio, sometimes called zone 2 cardio these days on the internet, which is performed continuously for 20 to 60 minutes at moderate intensity of 40 to 60% of VO2 max, or if you prefer heart rate, 55 to 70% of max heart rate. Okay. So we can think about high, medium, and low intensity exercise, although low intensity usually means that you could carry on a conversation, or maybe you'd have to gasp every few steps or so while trying to talk and run. That's, I think, going to be the most useful way to have this conversation that we're having now, because there's so many different forms of exercise that people do, and intensity is important. Let's ask the question that I think many of people are wondering about, which is it better, meaning do you burn more fat if you do your exercise fasted? And fasted in this respect could be that you wake up in the morning, you've been fasting all night, you just hydrate and you exercise. Or sometimes people will ingest caffeine. There's controversy as to whether or not that quote unquote breaks the fast. It has to do with whether or not you're caffeine adapted, something for another episode. In any case, that would be fasted. So probably not having eaten anything for anywhere from 3 to 24 hours or maybe even more. Because you could also be fasted in the afternoon if you had lunch at noon and it's 4 or 5 or 6 p.m. Will you burn more fat if you exercise without eating anything first, without ingesting any calories first? And people have tried to really split hairs on this every which way. People say, well, you can fat fast because fat and protein doesn't lead to as great increases in insulin as other things. Maybe you can have a few almonds and then still train. And indeed, insulin will prevent fat oxidation. I want to be really clear. The burning part of fat in the cell, the movement of the fatty acid and into mitochondria and the conversion to ATP, insulin inhibits that process. However, it's been shown that at least for short periods of training, it doesn't really seem to matter whether or not you eat before training or you don't, if your goal is fat oxidation. Now, I want to put an asterisk near that because there's some exceptions, but there were several studies done that, and the kind of the classic ones of these, I'll read out to you. What they basically did is they gave people glucose, sugar, blood, to increase their blood sugar before training or not. And the kind of classic study of this is Alborg et al. So 1976, so it goes way back, which is that glucose reduces fat burning in exercise. And then some other studies, if you want to look these up, they're very easy to find on PubMed. You put in Horowitz, 1999, Lee et al. Is another one where they have people drink milk with glucose in it, so sweet sugary milk before exercise, etc. And you can find a number of examples where eating before exercise reduces the amount of fat that's oxidized during the exercise. And you can also find a lot of studies showing that eating during exercise or prior to exercise will not reduce the amount of fat that's oxidized. However, the types of exercise, whether or not it was medium intensity or high intensity or low intensity, is all over the map for these studies. So it's very hard to target an ideal protocol. And then if you look really deep in the literature, you start to find meta-analyses where people have actually aggregated all the findings, and some modern studies where it points to some very specific and useful protocols. And so here's the rule or the protocol that I extracted from that literature. At a period of about 90 minutes of moderate intensity exercise, I want to be clear, at about or after 90 minutes of moderate intensity exercise, there's a switchover point whereby if you ate before the exercise, you will burn far less fat from the 90-minute point onward than you would if you had gone into the training fasted. So let me repeat that. If it's moderate intensity, so-called zone 2 cardio type exercise, at the 90-minute point, if you happen to have eaten before the exercise within 1 to 3 hours prior to the exercise, then you reduce the amount of fat that you will burn from 90 minutes onward. Whereas if you had fasted prior to the exercise, you hadn't eaten anything for 3 hours or more prior to the exercise, at the 90-minute point, 90 minutes of exercise, you will start to burn more fat than you would had you eaten. Now, 90 minutes of moderate intensity exercise is a lot. So that's a pretty long run. Even if you're running at a pretty slow pace, like a 10 or 12 minute mile, that's a lot of running. That's a lot of swimming. So that's a